it's the way it be. Bottom up economics in poverty. Get the homeless off the streets and a place to live. Bottom up economics got a lot to give. The folks struggling with ends to make ends meet. Bottom up universal basic income cheese. Stimulate the economy the right way. Universal basic income all the way. The single mother with kids, what to do? 2 G's per month cash in her pocket cool. Universal basic income cash flow. Economic stimulation, that's the way to go. Money in at the bottom, poor and middle class. Economic stimulation when they spend the cash. Bottom up economics, that's the way it be. Bottom up economics in poverty. It's time to roll with the bottom up at last. Throw the top down system in the trash. Bottom up economics is what it be. Bottom up universal basic income cheese. Bottom up economics, 2 G's a month. The mission to end poverty, that's what's up. Poor middle class rich gon' get the cheese. With the primary focus on the least of these. Bottom up economics is the way it be. Bottom up economics in poverty. Bottom up economics and universal basic income. BGMGproductions.com. B Goines and M Goines.
Welcome to Political Facts with Byron Goines
and Michelle Goines.
The song you heard is entitled Bottom Up Economics and Universal Basic Income and is available to purchase at bgmgproductions.com. We're on a mission to educate and inform our listeners on everything concerning politics that they will not hear through any other media. This is broadcast number 2 of 3 consecutive broadcasts dedicated to thoroughly explaining our legislative proposal for $2,000 in monthly United States government guaranteed lifetime universal basic income for all United States citizens at least 18 years of age. We will be submitting our legislative proposal to the incoming Biden administration, along with House members and Senate members. This lecture is available in its entirety for purchase at bgmgproductions.com. Let's get into part 2 of the lecture. The question of how to pay for new and existing social programs today was answered by President Franklin D. Roosevelt and President Richard Nixon, both of whom had contributions toward ending the gold standard in the United States. Back in the day, the gold standard is what placed the value on United States currency. In other words, the United States currency that was printed had to be backed by gold. So there had to be enough gold to cover the value of the United States currency that was printed. Gold was the standard at that time. President Franklin D. Roosevelt figured out how to inflate the money supply and ended the gold standard on June 5, 1933. The History Channel website at www.history.com, in an article entitled FDR Takes United States Off Gold Standard, states the following information. On June 5, 1933, the United States went off the gold standard, a monetary system in which currency is backed by gold, when Congress enacted a joint resolution nullifying the right of creditors to demand payment in gold. The article further states the following information. Soon after taking office in March 1933, President Roosevelt declared a nationwide bank moratorium in order to prevent a run on the banks by consumers lacking confidence in the economy. He also forbade banks to pay out gold or to export it. According to Keynesian economic theory, one of the best ways to fight off an economic downturn is to inflate the money supply. And increasing the amount of gold held by the Federal Reserve would in turn increase its power to inflate the money supply. Now, what this information is stating is that the United States had to increase the amount of gold held by the Federal Reserve in order to inflate the money supply. Or in other words, because the money supply had to be backed by gold, the money supply could not be increased unless the amount of gold held by the Federal Reserve was increased. President Roosevelt was able to increase the amount of gold held by the Federal Reserve so he could inflate the money supply. But it would have been a whole lot easier if the money supply had nothing backing it. This was one of the problems of capitalism that was rectified once the gold standard was officially ended by President Nixon in 1971. With no gold standard and the Federal Reserve having the ability to create money out of thin air at will, economic downturns could be addressed easily as the money supply could be inflated as needed. Concerning the gold standard, the Federal Reserve website states the following information. Federal Reserve notes are not redeemable in gold, silver, or any other commodity. Federal Reserve notes have not been redeemable in gold since January 30th, 1934, when Congress amended Section 16 of the Federal Reserve Act to read, "The said Federal Reserve notes shall be obligations of the United States. They shall be redeemed in lawful money on demand at the Treasury Department of the United States, in the city of Washington, District of Columbia, or at any Federal Reserve Bank. Federal Reserve notes have not been redeemable in silver since the 1960s. Now that I've covered President Roosevelt's connection to ending the gold standard, let's examine President Nixon's connection to ending the gold standard. The United States Department of State Office of the Historian website states the following information. On August 15, 1971, President Richard M. Nixon announced his new economic policy, a program to create a new prosperity without war. Known colloquially as the Nixon Shock, the initiative marked the beginning of the end for the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates established at the end of World War II. Under the Bretton Woods system, the external values of foreign currencies were fixed in relation to the U.S. dollar, whose value was in turn expressed in gold at the congressionally set price of $35 per ounce. By the 1960s, a surplus of U.S. dollars caused by foreign aid, military spending, and foreign investment threatened this system, as the United States did not have enough gold to cover the volume of dollars in worldwide circulation at the rate of $35 per ounce. As a result, the dollar was overvalued. Now, according to this information, there was not enough gold to cover the volume of U.S. dollars in worldwide circulation, and as a result, the dollar was overvalued. In other words, there were a lot of U.S. dollars in worldwide circulation that, when added up, totaled more than the amount of U.S. gold available to cover the value of those U.S. dollars at $35 per ounce. The U.S. dollar was unable to be supported, as proven in the article, which states, Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson adopted a series of measures to support the dollar and sustain Bretton Woods. Foreign investment disincentives, restrictions on foreign lending, efforts to stem the official outflow of dollars, international monetary reform, and cooperation with other countries. Nothing worked. Meanwhile, traders in foreign exchange markets, believing that the dollar's overvaluation would one day compel the U.S. government to devalue it, proved increasingly inclined to sell dollars. This resulted in periodic runs on the dollar. Now, according to this information, this presented a problem. The overvalue of the U.S. dollar, resulting from not having enough gold to cover the volume of U.S. dollars in circulation, could not be stopped. There were periodic runs on the dollar as a result, and everything they attempted to support the dollar did not work. Now, continuing on, the article also states, it was just such a run on the dollar, along with mounting evidence that the overvalued dollar was undermining the nation's foreign trading position, which prompted President Richard M. Nixon to act. On August 13, 1971, Nixon convened a meeting of his top economic advisors, including Secretary of the Treasury John Connally and Office of Management and Budget Director George Shultz, at the Camp David Presidential Retreat to consider a program of action. Now, according to this information, President Richard Nixon had a meeting to consider a program of action. Now, what was the program of action? The article further states, Nixon identified a threefold task. We must create more and better jobs. We must stop the rise in the cost of living. We must protect the dollar from the attacks of international money speculators. To achieve the first two goals, he proposed tax cuts and a 90-day freeze on prices and wages. To achieve the third, Nixon directed the suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. He also ordered that an extra 10% tariff be levied on all dutiable imports, like the suspension of the dollar's gold convertibility. This measure was intended to induce the United States' major trading partners to adjust the value of their currencies upward and the level of their trade barriers downward so as to allow for more imports from the United States. Now, according to this information, the suspending of the U.S. dollar's convertibility to gold had an impact on the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates. As the article further states, nevertheless, after months of negotiations, the group of 10, G10, industrialized democracies agreed to a new set of fixed exchange rates centered on a devalued dollar in the December 1971 Smithsonian Agreement. Although characterized by Nixon as the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world, the exchange rates established in the Smithsonian Agreement did not last long. 15 months later, in February 1973, speculative market pressure led to a further devaluation of the dollar and another set of exchange parities. Several weeks later, the dollar was yet again subjected to heavy pressure in financial markets. However, this time, there would be no attempt to shore up Bretton Woods. In March 1973, the G10 approved an arrangement wherein 6 members of the European Community tied their currencies together and jointly floated against the U.S. dollar, a decision that effectively signaled the abandonment of the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system in favor of the current system of floating exchange rates. Now, according to the information shared from the United States Department of State website, the Nixon administration's suspension of the gold standard resulted in fiat money, which is money that is made to be legal tender by the government, even though it has no gold backing it. Or in other words, money created out of thin air. Now, a lot of ideas were tried within the system to make it work without suspending the gold standard, but nothing worked. In the end, Nixon had to suspend the U.S. dollar's gold standard, which resulted in a devaluing of the U.S. dollar, which resulted in the end of the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system, replaced by a floating exchange rate system. Nixon's suspension of the U.S. dollar's gold standard opened the door for a $2,000 monthly United States federal government guaranteed universal basic income program indexed to inflation. Remember, there were more U.S. dollars in circulation than available U.S. gold to cover the value of those U.S. dollars, which resulted in a surplus of U.S. dollars. As a result, surplus U.S. dollars were being utilized by people, and there was no gold backing the value of those surplus U.S. dollars. As a result, Nixon ultimately suspended the gold standard in 1971, which resulted in the fiat money system, and there has been no gold backing dollars since that time. And this is the year 2020. So the fiat money system has survived. And remember, fiat money is money that is made to be legal tender by the government, even though it has no gold backing it. Or in other words, money created out of thin air. This makes the Federal Reserve System the best tool to utilize in funding $2,000 in monthly United States federal government guaranteed universal basic income for all U.S. citizens at least 18 years of age. Just as the Federal Reserve System is utilized to create money out of thin air to add liquidity to the banking system. With the end of the gold standard for the U.S. dollar, the amount of U.S. dollars in circulation and the value of those U.S. dollars in circulation are determined by the Federal Reserve as prescribed by Congress. The Federal Reserve website states the following information. The Congress has specified that Federal Reserve banks must hold collateral equal in value to the Federal Reserve notes that the Federal Reserve Bank puts into circulation. This collateral is chiefly held in the form of U.S. Treasury, federal agency, and government-sponsored enterprise securities. The Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air to increase the money supply. Now, the information from the Federal Reserve website states that collateral in the form of U.S. Treasury, federal agency, and government-sponsored securities must equal the value of the Federal Reserve notes in circulation. Now, let's look at how the Federal Reserve does this. The Federal Reserve has no money to begin the process of adding liquidity to the banking system. The Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air to purchase securities to add liquidity to the banking system, which makes it the perfect vehicle to utilize for funding our $2,000 monthly United States federal government guaranteed universal basic income program for citizens at least 18 years of age. The Federal Reserve website states the following information. The Federal Reserve System is the central bank of the United States. It performs 5 general functions to promote the effective operation of the U.S. economy and, more generally, the public interest. The Federal Reserve conducts the nation's monetary policy to promote maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates in the U.S. economy, promotes the stability of the financial system, and seeks to minimize and contain systemic risks through active monitoring and engagement in the U.S. and abroad, promotes the safety and soundness of individual financial institutions, and monitors their impact on the financial system as a whole, fosters payment and settlement system safety and efficiency through services to the banking industry and the U.S. government that facilitate U.S. dollar transactions and payments, and promotes consumer protection and community development through consumer-focused supervision and examination, research and analysis of emerging consumer issues and trends, community economic development activities, and the administration of consumer laws and regulations. Now, the information that I just shared with you covered the functions of the Federal Reserve. Concerning the history of the Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve website states the following information. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which established the Federal Reserve as the central bank of the United States, originally chartered the Federal Reserve banks for 20 years, but in the McFadden Act of 1927, the Congress rechartered the Federal Reserve banks into perpetuity. And so there is currently no expiration date or repeal date for the Federal Reserve. So as the information states, the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States, and there is no expiration date for the Federal Reserve. Next, let's look at the Federal Reserve's funding mechanism, because it does not come from United States taxpayers through a congressional budgetary process. The Federal Reserve's funding is explained on the Federal Reserve website and states the following information. The Federal Reserve does not receive funding through the congressional budgetary process. The Fed's income comes primarily from interest on government securities that it has acquired through open market operations. Other sources of income are the interest on foreign currency investments held by the Federal Reserve System, fees received for services provided to depository institutions, such as check clearing, funds transfers, and automated clearinghouse operations, and interest on loans to depository institutions. After paying its expenses, the Federal Reserve turns the rest of its earnings over to the U.S. Treasury. Now, the Federal Reserve's income comes from interest on government securities it acquires with no money, as it creates money as a credit into an account that the primary securities dealer's bank holds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The money placed into the primary securities dealer's account as a credit came from nowhere, or in other words, out of thin air. Remember, money has to come from somewhere in order to be placed into any account as a credit. This is true for everyone except the Federal Reserve System and its purchasing of securities to add liquidity to the banking system. Concerning the funding of the Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve website states the following information. The Federal Reserve is not funded by congressional appropriations. Its operations are financed primarily from the interest earned on the securities it owns. Securities acquired in the course of the Federal Reserve's open market operations. The fees received for price services provided to depository institutions, such as check clearing, funds transfers, and automated clearinghouse operations, are another source of income. This income is used to cover the cost of those services. After payment of expenses and transfers to surplus, limited to an aggregate of $10 billion, all the net earnings of the Federal Reserve banks are transferred to the U.S. Treasury. Now, the Federal Reserve earns interest on securities it acquires with no money. And let me repeat, it creates money as a credit into an account that the primary securities dealer's bank holds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The money placed into the primary securities dealer's account as a credit came from nowhere, or in other words, out of thin air. Remember, money has to come from somewhere in order to be placed into any account as a credit. This is true for everyone except the Federal Reserve System and its purchasing of securities to add liquidity to the banking system. Concerning open market operations, which is the procedure through which the Federal Reserve acquires its income and sets monetary policy, the Federal Reserve website states the following information. Open market operations, OMOs, the purchase and sale of securities in the open market by a central bank, are a key tool used by the Federal Reserve in the implementation of monetary policy. The short-term objective for open market operations is specified by the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC. Before the global financial crisis, the Federal Reserve used OMOs to adjust the supply of reserve balances so as to keep the federal funds rate, the interest rate at which depository institutions lend reserve balances to other depository institutions overnight, around the target established by the FOMC. Concerning the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, the Federal Reserve website states the following information. The term monetary policy refers to the actions undertaken by a central bank, such as the Federal Reserve, to influence the availability and cost of money and credit to help promote national economic goals. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 gave the Federal Reserve responsibility for setting monetary policy. The Federal Reserve controls the three tools of monetary policy: open market operations, the discount rate, and reserve requirements. The Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System is responsible for the discount rate and reserve requirements. and the Federal Open Market Committee is responsible for open market operations. Using the three tools, the Federal Reserve influences the demand for and supply of balances that depository institutions hold at Federal Reserve banks, and in this way alters the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is the interest rate at which depository institutions lend balances at the Federal Reserve to other depository institutions overnight. Again, let me repeat because I want to make sure you understand this important fact. The Federal Reserve's income comes primarily from the interest on government securities it acquires with no money, as it creates money as a credit into an account that the primary securities dealer's bank holds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The money placed into the primary securities dealer's account as a credit came from nowhere, or in other words, out of thin air. Remember, money has to come from somewhere in order to be placed into any account as a credit. This is true for everyone except the Federal Reserve System and its purchasing of securities to add liquidity to the banking system. These transactions are completed through open market operations, which the Federal Reserve controls, as stated in the information I just shared with you from the Federal Reserve website, as open market operations are listed as one of the tools of monetary policy it controls, along with the discount rate and reserve requirements. Now, how does the Federal Reserve create money out of thin air to begin the process of adding liquidity to the banking system through buying securities in open market operations? Through monetizing debt, as debt, credit, liabilities, assets, and balance sheets are what enable the Federal Reserve to create money. The Federal Reserve utilizes a credit to begin the process of adding liquidity to the banking system. Remember, the Federal Reserve purchases the securities through creating money out of thin air as a credit into an account that the primary securities dealer's bank holds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The money placed into the primary securities dealer's account as a credit came from nowhere, or in other words, out of thin air. Remember, money has to come from somewhere in order to be placed into any account as a credit. This is true for everyone except the Federal Reserve System and its purchasing of securities to add liquidity to the banking system. The Federal Reserve website PDF, entitled Conducting Monetary Policy, in Figure 3.3 on page 35, gives the following example of how the Federal Reserve conducts open market operations. When the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, sets monetary policy that, for example, requires adding liquidity to the banking system to spur economic activity, it instructs the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's open market desk to purchase U.S. Treasury securities in the open market. Number 1, decides to reduce the target for the federal funds rate. Number 2, instructs the Federal Reserve Bank of New York desk to purchase securities. Number 3, purchases securities in the highly liquid market for U.S. Treasury securities from one of the designated approved primary dealers. Number 4, ensure that the market for the U.S. Treasury securities is liquid. In other words, they are always willing to sell securities and always willing to buy securities. Number 5, credits account that the primary dealer's bank holds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in exchange for securities. Number 6, the securities acquired are assets, and the bank accounts credited with the payment are liability items on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. Number 7, with the added funds in their accounts at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, banks can make more loans to businesses and individuals. Number 8, with increased opportunity to borrow, businesses and individuals are able to purchase mortgages, cars, and other items, boosting spending in the economy. Now, in this example, where did the Federal Reserve get the money to pay the primary dealer for the securities? The money came from nowhere. It created the money out of thin air that was placed in the system as a credit to the primary dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. According to the example in conducting monetary policy in figure 3.3 on page 35, the Federal Reserve has no money to pay the primary dealer in order to purchase the securities. In essence, the process of adding liquidity to the banking system begins with the Federal Reserve making a securities purchase with no money to begin with, as it creates money out of thin air that is placed in the system as a credit to the primary dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Remember, money has to come from somewhere in order to be placed into any account as a credit. This is true for everyone except the Federal Reserve System and its purchasing of securities to add liquidity to the banking system. Remember, the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air and places it in the system as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And the process is listed in plain sight on the Federal Reserve website, as I have just shown you. The Federal Reserve does not touch tax money. The Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air to add liquidity to the banking system. In the following audio clip from the television show 60 Minutes, posted to YouTube by CBS, listen to the words of former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve from 2006 to 2014, as Ben Bernanke confirms these facts concerning adding liquidity to the banking system. Now listen carefully to the words of Bernanke as money creation out of thin air is confirmed.
Is that tax money that the Fed is spending?
It's not tax money. The banks have accounts with the Fed much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed.
Now, as I have proven unequivocally, the Federal Reserve, through typing whatever amount it is in need of through some keystrokes, creates the money it needs to purchase the securities in order to add liquidity to the banking system. The money was created out of thin air, as the Federal Reserve has no money to begin with. Think about this. An entity that has no money whatsoever types some keystrokes to create the amount of money it needs. When you have no money to make a purchase, can you power up your computer and type some keystrokes to create the amount of money you need? Of course you can't. But the Federal Reserve can when it purchases securities in order to add liquidity to the banking system. Now remember, the Federal Reserve purchases securities by typing some keystrokes to create the amount of money it needs. These keystrokes create the money out of thin air as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank. Ben Bernanke also confirms these facts in a 2012 college lecture posted on YouTube by the Federal Reserve. Now listen carefully to this audio clip, as these words of Bernanke also confirm how the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank. Also, remember the question I addressed earlier. Where does the Federal Reserve get money to begin the process of adding liquidity to the banking system by buying securities in open market operations? Through monetizing debt, as debt, credit, liabilities, assets, and balance sheets are what enable the Federal Reserve to create money. Remember, the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air and places it in the system as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank, and this is also addressed by Ben Bernanke in the following audio clip.
Now, you might ask the question, well, the Fed's going out and buying $2 trillion of securities. How do we pay for that? And the answer is that we paid for those securities by crediting the bank accounts of the people who sold them to us. And those accounts at the banks showed up as reserves that the banks would hold with the Fed. So the Fed is a bank for the banks. Banks can hold deposit accounts with the Fed, essentially, and those are called reserve accounts. And so as the purchases of securities occurred, the way we paid for them was basically by increasing the amount of reserves that banks had in their accounts with the Fed. So you can see this here. This is the liability side of the Fed's balance sheet. Of course, assets and liabilities, including capital, have to be equal. So the liability side had also to rise near $3 trillion, as you can see.
Now, during this college lecture, Ben Bernanke stated that the Federal Reserve owned about $800 billion of securities at the beginning of the financial crisis before they purchased $2 trillion of new securities. Now, where did the Federal Reserve get the money to purchase the $2 trillion of new securities? The Federal Reserve created money out of thin air and placed it in the system as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank. The $2 trillion was created out of thin air. Now, how did the Federal Reserve get the $800 billion of securities that were on the balance sheet before they created money out of thin air to purchase the $2 trillion in new securities? The $800 billion in securities that were on the balance sheet were acquired the same way they acquired the $2 trillion in new securities. They were acquired by creating money out of thin air for the purchase, regardless of when they were purchased. The Federal Reserve purchases securities by creating money out of thin air and placing it in the system as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank. This is nothing new. The Federal Reserve has been doing this for many years, but most people don't know this truth. Now remember, according to the Federal Reserve website and the Federal Reserve audio clips, the Federal Reserve purchases securities through creating money out of thin air and placing it in the system as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank. This is exactly how the Federal Reserve creates money, out of thin air. Now, since the Federal Reserve can create money out of thin air and place it in the system as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank, then the Federal Reserve can create money out of thin air and place it in the system as a $2,000 monthly credit for every United States citizen 18 years of age or older. This Federal Reserve, money from nowhere out of thin air to spur economic growth system, can fund $2,000 in monthly government-guaranteed universal basic income, which will stimulate the economy and go a long way towards ending poverty in the United States and eliminate any need for taxpayer dollars to fund this program. In the example on the Federal Reserve website, the Federal Reserve credits the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in exchange for the securities. The securities purchased by the Federal Reserve with money created out of thin air are assets, and the bank accounts that receive the funds credited from the securities purchased with money created out of thin air are listed as liability items on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. With added funds in their accounts at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the banks can make more loans to businesses and individuals. Increased borrowing by businesses and individuals results in a boost in spending in the economy. Notice that it's talking about businesses and individuals going into debt through taking out loans, which boosts spending in the economy, but leaves businesses and individuals in debt, which is how the banks earn money, through the interest the banks charge those who take out loans with them. This is a banking system built by capitalists for capitalists, And this is a banking system that is built on monetizing debt, which is a topic for another lecture. And the money to make all of this possible came from nowhere. Or in other words, the money to make all of this possible was created out of thin air. How the Federal Reserve creates money is listed in plain sight on the Federal Reserve website for everyone to see, although many people are unaware of these facts. So let's go over this one more time before we move on. Now remember, the Federal Reserve creates money as a credit into an account that the primary securities dealers bank holds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The money placed into the primary securities dealer's account as a credit comes from nowhere, or in other words, out of thin air. Remember, money has to come from somewhere in order to be placed into any account as a credit. This is true for everyone except the Federal Reserve System and its purchasing of securities to add liquidity to the banking system. Because of the fact that the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air to spur economic growth, this makes the Federal Reserve the perfect vehicle to fund $2,000 in monthly government-guaranteed universal basic income for all United States citizens at least 18 years of age. Now, for those who may cry inflation concerning increasing the money supply to cover $2,000 in government-guaranteed universal basic income for all United States citizens at least 18 years of age. Concerning the money supply and its ties to GDP growth and inflation, the Federal Reserve website states the following information. Over recent decades, however, the relationships between various measures of the money supply and variables such as GDP growth and inflation in the United States have been quite unstable. As a result, the importance of the money supply as a guide for the conduct of monetary policy in the United States has diminished over time. The Federal Open Market Committee, the monetary policy-making body of the Federal Reserve System, still regularly reviews money supply data in conducting monetary policy, but money supply figures are just part of a wide array of financial and economic data that policymakers review. Now, in other words, the instability of the relationship between the money supply and economic variables such as GDP growth and inflation has led to the diminishment of the importance of the money supply as a guide for the conduct of monetary policy in the United States. Now, this information from the Federal Reserve website is a clear and concise answer for those who would worry about inflation because of an increase in the money supply. Also, inflation can be traced historically, and the economy continued to work as inflation has risen throughout the years. Let's look at historical inflation in the United States. According to the Consumer Price Index inflation calculator, located on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website, $100 in August 1960 had the same buying power as $878.10 in August 2020. So in this example, a person would have had to spend $878.10 in August 2020 to buy what that person could have bought for $100 in August 1960. So from August 1960 to August 2020, there was a rise totaling $778.10. Now let's cover another example in United States Consumer Price Index history from August 1913 to August 2020. $100 in August 1913 had the same buying power as $2,625.43 in August 2020. So in this example, a person would have had to spend $2,625.43 in August 2020 to buy what that person could have bought for $100 in August 1913. So from August 1913 to August 2020, there was a rise totaling $2,525.43. Now, as this information clearly shows, inflation has gone up over the years. which is nothing new and will continue to happen as history has shown. But the economy has continued to work regardless of inflation. Now, as the Federal Reserve website states, there is instability in the relationship between the money supply and economic variables such as GDP growth and inflation, which diminish the importance of the money supply as a monetary policy guide in the United States. But as a safety precaution against inflation, the $2,000 in monthly government guaranteed universal basic income will be indexed to inflation as a safeguard for everyone who receives it. As inflation rises, the amount of government guaranteed universal basic income will rise accordingly. We'll stop here for today, and we'll pick it up next time on Political Facts with Byron Goines
and Michelle Goines.
Talking about universal basic income. Poor and middle class people gon' get some. We talking about 2 G's a month in the bank. Cash money, bottom up, economics bank. Rich folk with skrill gon' get it too. Money from bottom to top, this the way it do. Fed with no money, credit pushing banks up. Creating money from nothing, top down stuff. Benefiting nobody but the rich folks. A system of capitalism from coast to coast. Time to change up the system, folks had enough. Use the credit injected, running bottom up. Bottom up economics is the way it be. Bottom up economics in poverty. Get the homeless off the streets and a place to live. Bottom up economics got a lot to give. The folks struggling with ends to make ends meet. Bottom up universal basic income cheese. Stimulate the economy the right way. Universal basic income all the way. The single mother with kids, what you do? 2 G's per month cash in her pocket, cool. Universal basic income, cash flow. Economic stimulation, that's the way to go. Money in at the bottom, poor and middle class. Economic stimulation when they spend the cash. Bottom up economics, that's the way it be. Bottom up economics in poverty. It's time to roll with the bottom up at last. Throw the top down system in the trash. Bottom up economics is